Hey everybody, nice to see you. Welcome to block 2 of our Bill of Rights unit. I'm going to walk you through a few things and you'll hopefully take some notes and take a quiz and be on your way. So we're going to start off today with me doing a quick screen share. Let me jump over to our Word document that I have pulled up real quick. So if you look here, this document is in Google Classroom. It's in your unit packet. If you scroll down to where the block 2 section is, which is right about here. And let's take a look at the Second Amendment. So here it is, the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So we know that the founding fathers, especially Jefferson, Madison, and Mason, when they were creating the Bill of Rights, we know that a lot of the reasoning behind the Bill of Rights was because they were still very suspicious that an authoritarian government similar to England and King George III would someday in the future maybe be able to twist and go around the separation of power and figure out a way to get power back. So the Bill of Rights was basically your list of rights that very specifically said what U.S. citizens would and wouldn't be able to do. Now, the Second Amendment, essentially, as far as I understand, their argument would be is they wanted the citizens to be armed so that they would be able to take the fight to anybody that threatened their freedom. So if there was like some authoritarian power, even if it was the government at the time, if the government turned into a authoritarian dictatorship, the citizens would have the means to fight back to protect that. So that's kind of the core of the Second Amendment. And really what this does is it, and how it's been interpreted, we're going to see this, is it gives people the right to have a weapon. Now, with any of these amendments, there's always a limit. And our Second Amendment today does have a limit, and the limit kind of goes back and forth, or at least it has since the founding of the Bill of Rights. And we're going to look at that with a case specifically District of Columbia versus Heller. But for all intents and purposes, if you are a U.S. citizen and you want a gun, you get a gun. It's not like a privilege. Some other countries make it kind of like a privilege. Like if you go to Japan today, it's almost like you have to apply for it, like to get a license. In the United States, though, if you are 18 years old and you are wanting a gun, you can get one. So let's check out the PowerPoint. I'm going to bop over here. Hopefully you're going to be able to see this okay. To our block 2. These are some of the questions in the PowerPoint you can go over. Just trying to get your mind warmed up to thinking about where the limit should be for the Second Amendment. So if you want to take a moment to go through and you could look through these questions and kind of think about what your response would be. Here's some more, questions 6, 7, and 8. Here's a political cartoon that gets in kind of the fact that this is a very contentious issue. A lot of people have very passionate feelings about it. Here's the one guy saying, everyone should own a gun. And this guy is going back to him saying, no one should own a gun. And here's the kid that's just like, can you please just work this out, please? Okay, and one last thing I was going to say about the Second Amendment before we get to our first Supreme Court case in District of Columbia versus Heller. So yeah, if we go back to the page right here and we look at the Second Amendment, really this idea that U.S. citizens would have guns and protect themselves from authoritarian regime, it started off being this kind of idea of a well-regulated militia. And I know what you're maybe thinking is like, what's a militia? Well, a militia is just like kind of anytime you have regular people that join and form like a kind of impromptu little kind of gang or military force. So that's what a militia is. And originally you had this thing called the state militias that started coming out before the Civil War. These state militias were voluntary citizens that came together in the United States. And the Civil War is an example of where, when it started, the state militias were the ones that, in theory, fought what they thought was the authoritarian government at the time, which was the election of Abraham Lincoln. So they rose up with their militias and their guns because they viewed him as a tyrant, and wanted to fight back against him. So this is almost like kind of the Second Amendment gone to the extreme. That the catch was is that Abraham was like duly elected. It wasn't like he necessarily seized power like an authoritarian person. But that's not how the Southerners at that time felt, or the most of them at least. You guys probably remember when Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if you guys know the story of this, but he like essentially assassinates Lincoln, jumps from the theater holding on to like a ribbon or something, and slides down, breaks his leg on the stage, and essentially says something in Latin. I can't exactly remember what. Basically, he was saying like "death to the dictator." So Booth, who was kind of sympathetic to the Southern cause, he was very much against Lincoln because he thought he was like an authoritarian dictator. But the reality was he was just an elected president. So the Civil War breaks out. This is basically the state militia in theory enacted to try and fight what they viewed as authoritarian. And then when the Civil War ended, it was kind of like, wait a minute, maybe we're going to change how we think about the Second Amendment. Now, in terms of limits of the Second Amendment, an example of this would be in the 19, I want to say like 80s and 90s, they passed an assault weapon ban. And that was one example where during the time they came together, lawmakers and Congress came together and made it to where assault weapons were banned. But that kind of ran out and the limit got pushed around a little bit. So, you know what? Let me try and think if we can pop over. I want to see if it gets the limits. Yeah, why don't I jump to the limits right now? So, like we said, with any of our amendments to the Constitution, there's always limits, right? And so when you think about a firearm, if you start right now in the United States, the limit is that you are able to have a semi-automatic rifle. So if you think like an AR-15, essentially this is legal. You're allowed to have it. However, if you want a fully automatic weapon, that's where you pull the trigger and it just keeps shooting without you lifting it up. These types of weapons are banned. So are like bazookas or like RPGs. So it would be like having a tank or an F-16 fighter, even like a nuclear bomb. So you definitely are able to have a weapon. However, there is a limit on it. And right now, the limit is right in between semi-automatic weapons and fully automatic weapons. So here are some other limits on the Second Amendment that have come up that also limit what that's look like. And there's been multiple Supreme Court cases have kind of set this up. So here are some of the limits on the Second Amendment. So owners, if you're a convicted felon, if you have illegal drug, or if you're an illegal drug user, or if you've been dishonorably discharged from the military, you are not allowed to have a firearm. There's our types of guns. You basically are not allowed to have fully automatics, RPGs, tanks, or nuclear weapons. Guns in public, you can do this thing called concealed carry, but that is a privilege. You do have to ask permission to be able to do that. Right now, guns for the most part are prohibited in schools, although that has changed in some local places, including Colorado. There are some Colorado school districts that do allow their teachers, if they're trained, to have guns in schools. Definitely not allowed to have guns in government buildings, airports, polling places. A lot of times, if you are going to buy a weapon, you do have to go through a background check to make sure that you haven't done these things, like that you're not a convicted felon. And sellers must keep a paper record of their sale. So these are some of the ways it's been limited. And speaking of it being limited, District of Columbia is a great Supreme Court case where you can see where this limit was kind of pushed and came back the other way. So in the Supreme Court case, Heller was as far as I understand, a police officer, and he lived inside the District of Columbia, like Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. had a super high murder rate, and so they said, hey, why don't we make a law that bans having handguns, just like you see here? And so that's exactly what they did. They made a law that banned handguns, and Heller was just like, wait a minute, I feel like my Second Amendment gives me the right to have a gun to protect myself in my house. And so he basically sued This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a very close ruling, 5-4, agreed with Heller. They basically struck down the Washington, D.C. law and said, you absolutely do have the right to have a handgun. And furthermore, one of the justices of the time said that American citizens are able to have a handgun and any basically rifle in their house to protect their homes, as opposed to it being connected to a state militia. So basically, this case guaranteed the right for you to own a gun to protect your home. So, on Google Classroom, there's a few videos you can watch. I have one about District of Columbia versus Heller. There's also kind of a funny one with Key and Peele that gets at kind of like, what do you think the founding fathers would think about if they knew about the weapons we have in this day and age? Ultimately, if we jump back here, here's what I want you to do. I want you to jot down what happened in this case. And then ultimately, I want you to say, what do you think the Second Amendment should be? Do you think it's good as it is? Do you think we need to limit it more? Do you think we need to expand it more? Or do you think it's good as is? Go ahead and take a minute to write down. If you were going to rewrite the Second Amendment, what would you do? If you're going to add something to it, what would you say? That's pretty much it that I have for block 2. Thanks so much for joining. Okay, bye.